Hi, this is Leslie, and this is another in a series of videos, actually the first one, if we do not count the introductory video, which I have already posted. So this would be the first video in a series that I have provisionally entitled the Rambler tutorials. And the reason I entitled it this way is because of the possibly rambling type of style that I will be or maybe employing. And this style, I might add, is a sort of style that I have in fact used in my teaching career, which spans over 18 years in 2 years in Canada and the remainder here in Malaysia. A teaching career where I taught a number of subjects, economics, law, history, social issues, and even basic foundation mathematics and other subjects as well. So in the last few years, since about 2002, I have been engaged in the Islamic sector, 5 years at a university in Ilai, the Islamic Science University of Malaysia. And after that, an additional 10 years at the International Institute of Advanced Islamic Studies, also here in Malaysia. So during the course of my studies and my work in the Islamic sector, I became aware of a number of anomalies or sort of issues that were kind of sitting on my mind, and I was trying to resolve them, because I began to discover a sort of discrepancy between what I was reading in the Quran, and I was reading it practically on a daily basis, and what I was hearing from my colleagues, and what I was reading even in some of the articles and books that I was reading at the same time as well. So I realized there was a sort of disconnect here between what the Quran was conveying and with what the people were saying, sometimes also about the Quran. So of course I tried to resolve this inconsistency or these mixed signals or conflicting messages as best I could. And I have kind of narrowed it down to a kind of a framework whereby the entire debate of interpretation, not only of the teaching of Revelation, but even of Islamic history, kind of revolves around three major factors. And these factors are, firstly, Revelation itself, or the Quran, and secondly, rationality or reason, or in Arabic what we call aql, or in jurisprudence where it is normally referred to as, the use of the aql is referred to as a process called ijtihad, or independent or critical reasoning. And finally, the third factor would be tradition, which is mostly made up of the statements attributed to the Prophet Muhammad, peace be on him. And these statements now constitute a very large source of Islam, and they may be found in 6 canonical books, but there are of course many additional books that also purport to or claim to contain the various sayings of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be on him. So now the entire Islamic history, it seems to me, as it developed over time, revolves around the interplay between these three factors. And by studying this interplay, I think we can understand better what exactly transpired in history and what is the significance of these developments for us in modernity, looking back and trying to, as it were, apply or reapply, and even rediscover the original teaching of Islam, which may have been clouded to some extent by a loss of what I would suggest was a kind of harmony or balance between these three factors, revelation, reason, and tradition. Because it seems to me that initially, with the coming of Islam in its form at the time of the revelation of the Quran, revelation reigned supreme. That was pretty obvious. But with time, certain differences developed between people about how exactly to understand or approach or interpret the Quran. So now these groups basically, there were basically 2 groups of people. On the one hand, we had the rationalists who recommended the use of aql or intelligence or reason, if you like. And on the other hand, we find the people of tradition, or the al-Hadith, as they are sometimes called, who recommended consulting the traditions of the Prophet, peace be on him, in order to understand the revelation better and in fact to apply the revelation better. Of course, one problem with this second approach was that only about 15% of the verses in the Quran have any traditions to comment on them. So the picture remains quite incomplete in that regard. But we may return to that point on another occasion. So what I decided or wanted to do today was to look at one particular incident in the history of Islam that is normally not highlighted that much, and comment on it and make some suggestions as to how we can perceive this event in this interplay of the three factors which I mentioned, revelation, reason, and tradition. And the event I'm referring to is the so-called slaughter of the philosophers by Musa al-Hadi in 786, which was reported to us by Suyuti and related to us more recently by Jalaluddin al-Afghani. So in a book that was published by Oxford University Press and edited by Charles Kurtzman, and this book was apparently published in 2002, and the quotation comes from an article called Syed Jamal al-Din Afghani's Response to Renan, and the name of the book is Modernist Islam, 1840 to 1940, a source book. And the page number where this quotation comes from is 110. So here's what Jalaluddin al-Afghani had to say in his debate, and I will read it verbatim as a quotation. It's only about 7 or 8 lines, and after that I will comment on it and try to place this quotation and the event it refers to into this broader framework which I have outlined earlier. So the quotation goes like this. This is what Jalaluddin al-Afghani reportedly said in his debate with Renan. Okay, I'm quoting. Jalal al-Din al-Suyuti, Egyptian scholar, 1445 to 1505, tells us that the Caliph Musa al-Hadi, who reigned from 785 to 786, put to death in Baghdad 5,000 philosophers in order to destroy sciences in the Muslim countries down to their roots. Admitting that this historian exaggerated the number of victims, it remains nonetheless established that this persecution took place, and it is a bloody stain for a history of a religion as it is for a history of a people. End of quote. So I have already provided you with the reference. So now let's take a look at the significance of this, the event that this quotation refers to. Well, it seems to me that this event was an example of the conflicts between the people of reason and the people of tradition. And obviously, in this case, Musa al-Hadi, the caliph at the time, clearly supported the traditionists against the rationalists. So this massacre of the allegedly of 5,000 philosophers was in fact a big blow against reason and rationality in Islamic history. Quite frankly, as someone who also taught history in my prior career, this event reminded me of one event quite similar to this one, which took place actually 1,000 years later, practically, in Europe, in revolutionary France, during the time of the French Revolution, when, as you may recall, the French revolutionaries, under the leadership of Maximilien Robespierre of the faction of the Jacobins, instituted the so-called Reign of Terror, and where they were basically exterminating their opponents, who mainly belonged to the people who supported tradition. In other words, the people that supported the monarchy, which the French revolutionaries were trying to overthrow at the time in the name of reason, and as part of the process of the so-called Enlightenment. So what we have here is a kind of a parallel situation. The number of people that were slaughtered at the guillotine during the French Revolution was around 16,000. So now this number is more than 3 times higher than the number of philosophers that were apparently slaughtered by Musa al-Hadi. But if you take into account the fact that the world population was probably much smaller 1,000 years earlier, as a percentage of the total global population, the 5,000 may not have been so far behind the 16,000 who died during the French Revolution. So both events were quite cataclysmic and had significant consequences for the development of history thereafter in each place at each time. So here I think we see an example of a serious imbalance between tradition and reason, and the failure to somehow reach a proper relationship between the two, a balanced relationship where reason and tradition can actually mutually support each other rather than struggle against each other and see the other as an enemy to be subdued or even exterminated, as happened in these two incidents. Now, in these two incidents, of course, revelation in both cases was kind of sidelined and not followed, because if revelation had been followed, these massacres would have never taken place in the first place. So what we see here in both of these incidents is a sort of drifting away from the teaching of revelation, both in the Muslim world and also in the Western world during the Age of Reason, where the teaching of revelation was disregarded by the people who perpetrated these horrible crimes. Now, so this much about the context and the significance of these events. Now, to conclude, I would like to highlight the consequences of this massacre in the Muslim world were such that reason was further repressed, and this was reinforced later on by the so-called closure of the doors to ijtihad, which took place around the year 1000. And it was this repression of reason was then further even more reinforced by Al-Ghazali's denunciation of the philosophers as heretics and disbelievers, because this was also a serious blow against rationalism, insofar as to be called an apostate or a heretic or a disbeliever in those days and even today amounted essentially to a pronouncement of a death penalty on the person who was accused of being a heretic, an apostate, or a disbeliever. So the effect on the Muslim world of this assault on rationality and reason was such that the modern sciences never really had a chance to develop fully, and as a result, Muslims remained behind in the sciences and also in scientific and research output globally. They have, Muslims now have very few universities in the top universities, and there are other indicators of this lagging behind of the Islamic civilization as a result of the repression of reason that took place centuries earlier. In other words, we are still seeing and feeling the effects of this repression. So we need, in other words, to recover and rehabilitate reason and to restore it to its position of, to its proper position, where it helps us to understand both revelation and tradition, and in fact helps us to achieve a kind of balance between all three, between the revelation and tradition, but also between revelation and reason, and reason and tradition. Now, on the Western side, the result of the massacre of the supporters of the monarchy during the French Revolution basically entrenched in the Age of Enlightenment and the Age of Reason and in Europe. And one consequence of this was a marginalization of revelation, which no longer provided the sort of guidance it used to do in the past. So as a result of the marginalization of revelation in the Western world, certain practices that were previously prohibited, such as adultery and collection of usury or interest, became legalized, and these two lapses, as I would call them, or aberrations even, perhaps is a better word, are now really hurting the West, in the sense that we are seeing a great increase in divorces, but also many threats to the economy arising from the massive indebtedness of developed nations who have legalized usury and allowed it to proliferate and to cast the entire globe, in fact, deeply into debt. And we will have to see how this actually works out and whether we can find a way out of this. So that's all for my presentation today. I hope you can leave your comments below if you have any questions. Until next time, we'll see you then. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.